Welcome, everybody. We are the Village of Lovers filmmaking team. And we just want to say thank you for your patience. We were having some technical difficulties figuring out our slideshow that we've built that we're so excited to share with you. And we just want to say a wholehearted welcome. We've been seeing people in the chat sharing about where you are on this beautiful planet. If you want to go ahead and share where you are, maybe a gratitude, that is fully welcome. We'll be sharing things from the chat throughout. We really love people having their dialogue and voice as part of this. And you have landed here with us for a beautiful webinar that is beyond just us. Sharing really about our 10 years of research into how love and sexuality and community need to become woven to build a sustainable and beautiful social ecology that's for us at the heart of the revolution of our times. Heard a little feedback there, Ian, but I think it's good.
Yep, it's all good. Yep.
And that, we came to this film project, The Village of Lovers, 10 years ago, really in this inquiry after being social change filmmakers for the previous 10 years, each of us, traveling the world, asking the question, like, what is it going to take to really create global system change? And that whole arc of a journey led us eventually to meeting each other and to Tamera and to the foundations of what a relational paradigm shift could be and why that has implications that we believe is global in impact and cuts to the core of how humanity can shift into a truly regenerative culture at this time. So we're gonna do this short personal introductions now. So I'm gonna start and pass it over to Julia.
Thanks, John. Hi, everybody. My name is Julia Marianska. John and I are currently located in Northern California, which was the original land of the Pomo and Miwok, Coast Miwok people. And I am a white and Jewish cisgendered woman. I am an immigrant also coming from Poland, and I am I'm a mother, I am a partner, I am polyamorous, I am bisexual, and I occupy a lot of privileged identities and also some marginalized ones. And we wanted to start out this webinar by speaking to our positionalities and our identities and how we may be holding certain biases based on the positions that we occupy, and what has brought us here today, in addition to making the film, as John mentioned, is the many years of cultural research of what are the innovative solutions for system change on the fringes of society. I have spent 14 years living in land-based and urban and decentralized intentional communities, and done a lot of community circle training practices, and all of that informs what we'll be sharing today.
Thanks, Julia. Thank you, Ian. Over next to you.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks for everyone for tuning in here. I am coming at you from Cowichan territory, which is over on Vancouver Island. And I myself as well have been an activist filmmaker for a good almost 20 years now, really asking this question, how did we get here, and what happens if I kind of keep pulling the thread, which led me to these two who are also pulling some similar threads. As far as my own positionality and relationally, I was in a monogamous marriage for 10 years until that ended. I was polyamorous for 5 years, and now I'm in, I would call it a intentionally monogamous partnership, as well as I'm a father. And I'm going to be drawing as well from other, decade in the Orphan Wisdom School with Stephen Jenkinson, as well as really giving energy and attention and passion to trying to understand community and living in different community frameworks over the last usually about 7 or 8 years now. So that'll all hopefully show up in a useful way here today. Johnny.
Thanks, Ian. I'm John Wolfstone. I'm a white, cisgendered, mostly heterosexual man of Jewish and Germanic, Celtic, and English descent. And, you know, like Ian and Julia, I've been traversing so much of the fringe, trying to understand how to translate the beautiful emerging solutions that are happening on the fringe, and how do we bring those and weave those into a story that can actually come back into the mainstream and support system change on a much wider scale. And in my own personal life, this looked like a lot of initiation, a lot of shadow work, a lot of going into the depths of my own biographical, personal, and ancestral traumas, and really recognizing that I've had a lot of the privilege, you know, coming from an owning class family as a white male American, to do a lot of that work. And that's part of the lens that I bring here. And I've had the privilege to really weave many places on this beautiful planet. And really also as a single person who doesn't have children, who I am unique in that on this team, weaving often between California and British Columbia, between Ian and Julia, and really being a pollinator, carrying those stories and really working through a rites of passage lens, and how rites of passage are at the foundations of culture. So that's some of the lenses that I am bringing here. And I'm so excited today because, as we said, and maybe Ian, you can pop up to the first slide, which is our intro slide.
Great. Yeah, I'll do that now. And just as we say, it'll be a little jostling as we organize the slides to come up. So let me just double check here that this is all going to be working clearly.
Yeah.
Do you see that there?
Yeah, and as Ian's pulling up, if you're joining live and you haven't yet, you can pop into the chat where you're tuning in from. It's nice to see the global community listening.
And can you confirm that that's now full screen?
Yeah.
We got it, Ian. Thank you.
Okay, great.
So beyond just us, community is a catalyst for rejuvenating personal relationships. And next slide, Ian.
All right, our premise. So we wanted to start with really our thesis statement, which I'll read out loud. Thriving love relationships and community are not separate, but rather mutually symbiotic foundations of a sustainable relational ecology, and thus organically form as a mutual co-arising. This premise is really born out of our recognition that we are living in a dominant culture of separation, and we, in the course of this arc, will be weaving how love relationships and community, as well as beyond just romantic love relationships, but all kinds of relationships, are part of the web and ecosystem that create thriving communities.
Next slide, Ian. So the arc of this webinar, so we're going to talk about, like, what is the overculture? What has mass culture told us about what to believe around community and love? We're going to share a short mytho-history of how we got here. We're going to redefine some basic terms so we can all be on the same, like, intellectual ground. We're going to remember some more organic paradigms as far as approaching community and love relationships. And we're going to then talk about some strategies and tools for restitching our own relational webs. And then at the end, we're going to talk about possible next steps, including a Summer of Love online course that we're going to be holding this summer with a small group to go much deeper into this subject matter and practice. next slide again.
Okay. So I understand this is on me to frame, and also part of it was to ask a question of the audience, but I can't actually see comments right now. So perhaps it wouldn't be me to track the comments of folks. But this opening slide is really meant to ask the question before we get in too deep. Chances are where you grew up and how you've been conditioned has influenced you heavily upon what we consider to be normal, expected, default, unquestioned, and basically invisible in a lot of ways, such as the water we're swimming in. And so we wanted to pose the question as we be sort of before we really wade in deeper, is so what are some of these implicit expectations or shared understandings that you might carry around what relationship is, about power, or what society has imposed on you in sort of a variety of realms. And we wanted to actually ask you that now for the chat, to point in the comments of what that comes to when we ask this question. Like, what are some societal expectations that you've been conditioned into? That, again, if you grew up in a beautiful tapestry of thriving village, again, maybe hold off on your responses. But like most of the other folks who probably grew up some form of the dominant culture, we'd love to hear from you, and we'll take a few moments and just track what may come to you as we ask this question, and any other context you want to give, John and Julie, as well.
I think that's good. Yeah, I'd love to hear from all of you. Yeah, what are the things that you reflect on now? Are just the base assumptions of what culture has given us.
Yeah, and we're also with this question, we are I'm seeing things like figure things out on your own is one implicit or explicit agreement, or that I'd be a good girl. And we also encourage you to think systemically. What are the systemic agreements that our society is ruled by? There's a sense of ownership over a romantic partner. Okay, don't make trouble. The basic premise of domination culture rests upon a belief in the efficacy of violence. Yeah. So I'm reading these from the chat. So, and if you suppress your emotions, you must be productive or certified to be valued.
Ownership of children. Yeah, and we're really seeing some themes here, around certain hierarchies of what is important and what is not important.
It's a big one. Emotional intimacy as adults is often exclusively with a romantic partner.
Yeah, that I hear the word ownership coming up again, which we're going to definitely speak to. There's so many that do kind of fall into basic areas. So, Ian, you want to go to the next slide?
So maybe I can touch in on this as well as we look at these different areas. But one of the things that people tend to have a shared sense of, even without necessarily, like, you can take a poll, right, of most folks that grew up in dominant culture, and they'll understand when I say this idea of the myth of the one, right? There's the sought after other person that, whether it's Jerry Maguire and You Complete Me, or a sense of bound up in a romantic container or a romantic flavor of some sense, right? That there's somebody else out there for you, divine union, twin flame, all these things that, again, can, on the positive side, can be a beautiful way of experiencing these emotions and feelings of attraction and love. And on the other hand, also kind of the scorpion's tail carry with them all of these other elements and dysfunctions that many of us are probably quite familiar with, as well as the monogamy by default, of course, is another. That, again, unless you've been exposed to a certain degree of alternative communities, alternative lifestyles, which today is more so, I would say, given the proliferation of Instagram, YouTube, like these kinds of conversations are certainly, even now, having a bit of a renaissance moment. But even when we started the film project almost 10 years ago, certainly it wasn't as mainstream talked about even. But that monogamy by default, as well, is generally unchallenged in most people's upbringing. And then how that relates to private property, the sense of ownership, as was mentioned in the comments, as well as this sense of the nuclear family as the foundational building block of society as a whole. That in itself is generally unchallenged as the foundational element. But how does that spill over into things like the justice system and this question of power over, or the threat of violence, as somebody named, punitive measures in order to correct behavior, right? Things like that, that you can see the link now to the nuclear family. And again, this threat of punishment often being present in order to condition behavior in children. And then finally, that we relate primarily to the marketplace and society as consumers. And even in the question around love, right? Like these days, it's quite common actually to have this sense of, am I getting my needs met in the relationship? And if I am or not, that depends on whether I stay, right? Which is, again, is a very, it's a very marketplace kind of relationship with another human being. But these are the kind of things that spill from the paradigm that we've been conditioned into. John and Julia, anything else you want to add?
I mean, maybe I'll go on to the next slide and I will kind of extrapolate it out. So also to say that, you know, these are all linking into some base societal mythos. You know, first and foremost, a mythos of separation, that we are, you know, separate entities, again, operating in this sense of exchange with each other. And because we are separate, in kind of a vying or a competition for a certain scarcity of resources, which has then created another mythos around ownership. You know, we saw that a lot coming up in talking about the ownership of children, or the ownership of land, or even the ownership of partners, or the ownership of one's fidelity or sexuality. And not that there can't be bounds and boundaries around tending and around care and around prioritization, but this is actually coming from this base idea that we can inherently own things. Mm-hmm. That's actually at the core of the like capitalist mythos that we live in. And
I'll chime in about privacy, which is what we're seeing as prevalent as a value, right? That in the advent of the nuclear family and the couple, most of our intimacy, and this was written in the chat, is relegated to the private realms of these closest relationships. And so while it's common to have friends or what we might even call community, there is more often than not a holding back of the deepest issues, of the deepest longings, of the grapplings that we may bring into the romantic relationship, into a therapist relationship. And so as a result, what the mythos of the current culture does is it increases hyper individualization in thinking that we are unique to be feeling these problems, that we are perhaps other than, and somebody else wrote the us versus them dynamic that is one of the implicit agreements of dominant culture, and privacy is at the root of that. And then we move into the punitive aspect of our justice system. And so what we recognize is that when there are certain implicit and explicit agreements and laws, first of all, we could really unpack that. What are those? Who are those laws written by, right? And what do they, who do they privilege? Who do they benefit? And who is actually outside of a justice system that keeps people unjustly separated, incarcerated, imprisoned. And that very act of extracting a person from society and putting them into isolation, it links back into that original separation mythos that is a driving function of our society.
And that basic punitive like way of keeping the order in our society is very deep, and it reinforces also privacy and all of these other mythos, because it creates a condition where instead of wanting to share openly, authentically who we are, and often this starts very early in childhood, we want to actually hide and conform and present and be a good girl or a good boy or a good person because we're so conditioned to believe is that if we show who we really are, or if we step out of line from whatever the cultural norm is, we will be punished and maybe be cast as some kind of other with the threat of exile, which is the deepest threat and fear for a human being going deep into the arc of our prehistory, which we're going to talk about next.
Next slide.
Yeah,
Next slide. So on that thread, I think it's just important for us to see, because so much of this water that we are swimming in is an extremely modern lens, and we tend to forget the wider arc of our human heritage and actually what is really existing within our within our DNA and within what we call the morphogenetic field of what even like we expect coming into this world. Because for during all of the Stone Ages, the Mesolithic, Paleolithic, Neolithic, human beings lived in tribal groups from about 3 million-ish years ago, when our species kind of diverged from the last common ape ancestor, to about 3000 BCE. Again, rough dates, but to only a few thousand years ago did we exist in these tribal groups. And then, you know, for many reasons that many people have written about, many of them positing into agriculture, the age of civilization came, which really became the age of empire, where we shifted from tribal groups into these more nation state empire systems of social identity and belonging. But that age, which is pretty much the arc of full human like written history, is really only the last 5,000 or so years, which is a blip. That's like less than 1% on the entire arc of our species existence. So said another way, 99% of our species existence, of our ancestors, existed as the primary unit of social organization in a tribal village setting. And so that is the true inheritance of where we are coming from. So what we've been taught is normal is actually the small aberration at the end of a very long arc of humanity. You can go to the next slide, Ian.
So was this you, John, starting, or should I?
It's you.
Okay. Okay, so what does that mean in terms of the water we're swimming in now? So we draw on some of the work of Riane Eisler, who some of you may know. She wrote the book, The Chalice and the Blade, among other books, including really leaning into this question of domination culture versus partnership culture. And I found this helpful. We found this helpful as a way of kind of unpacking the way that we approach the current ability to really shift the current paradigm, because oftentimes this dominator paradigm is one way of understanding how we typically, or a certain approach to understanding it through the label patriarchy. But that tends to also include other things that may or may not be actually warranted. So it's a bit of a tricky term. Riane Eisler uses the term androcracy to actually mean the sense of the rule of men as a dominator paradigm. Now, that's helpful because it also kind of decouples the sense of that it's somehow a default of men, or a flaw of men, to somehow find their way into power and then to dominate and oppress. But actually, it's a cultural mimetic, you could say. And so how that filters down then, of course, is from the sense of identity shifting from tribal. And I think it's important as well because the term tribalism is often used these days to actually mean a kind of sequestering of identity into polarized groups. And that's actually not what we mean here. So here we mean the identity of what we'll get into later about, a sort of tribal identity within community context. But the nation state as the replacement for that, as essentially a fiction, that for most places that the nation state, Canadian, American, right, there's a certain implicit willingness to agree that that's where the identity comes from in the absence of true belonging to people and place. Because before that, and obviously for indigenous groups now, their sense of identity derives specifically from particular places, such as the language and such as the lifeways. And so this is a very kind of, again, it's an aberration on the ways in which we've been living for so long to suddenly identify with a nation state.
And just to weave a quick point on that, as we can see, the danger of that is when you lack a more clear cultural identity, what happens is the rise of nationalism and even white supremacy. Again, whiteness as now this unit of like belonging in the absence of true cultural heritage. And you get this rise of nationalism, which really is like what is a big driver behind war at some level, because it's coming from a different construct around power and belonging and protection than a deeper sense of actually being rooted and belonging to a people and the earth.
Someone wrote
So to pick,
was a hell of a drug.
Nationalism, a hell of a drug, yeah. So to connect that with private property and surplus, now again, in terms of this historical arc, understanding that one way to wonder about it is how technology has enabled essentially a ability to store surplus, and that it was only through storing surplus, i.e. using more than was needed at the time, that was able to then be stored, and then different categories or classes of people in a hierarchical civilization could start to emerge. And then you have ruling classes and the lower classes. And then how that works with private property and ownership, suddenly in terms of this shift away from a kind of raising of children and relationships held in village, instead it became this idea of the smaller unit of ownership, i.e. women being the ownership of the man, as well as the necessity of wanting to pass on particular surplus through one's own bloodline. Yeah. Which is then where we get this whole thing around the trying to understand the keeping the bloodline pure, and therefore to pass on the wealth through those lines, as well as, of course, the big question around the control of female sexuality as that's a big thing that we could get into perhaps a bit later, but how that becomes, rather than maybe prior cultures that would have honored and venerated and held spaces for the power of female sexuality and eros, i.e. in temple spaces, for example, it now becomes sequestered into these smaller ownership dynamics as in some sense, like an inferiority complex, which is something Tamera has spent a lot of time in. But that's just a brief overview of how that shift happened. Yeah. Anything you want to say before I shift?
One thing that stands out to me so strongly under the private property heading is that when tribes were intact, and as some still are, a lot of the time tribes are connected to the ecosystem within which they live and organized around watersheds, around water sources. And the advent of private property, there's a delineation of certain land parcels, which are at times pretty arbitrary and not connected to actual ecological, the way the ecology of a landscape can flow, right? And so what I noticed, for example, I'm from an area in northern Poland where, and this is true for indigenous tribes in Europe all over, which many of which are long gone, is that every little bioregion would even have their own language dialect, which was informed by the earth itself. And so we start to see how with the advent of private property, there's a severance of people to land and to the natural flow of ecology, and how that would have informed their culture, their sense of belonging, and their sense of, that sense, we'll talk about this later, their sense of secure attachment with more than just the human world, but with the land itself as well.
And really just in all levels of this, beyond even the loss of village, I think what we're sharing is that with the loss of village as the unit holding a human being in relationship to everything, it really was just the abject loss of relationship overall. And the absence of relationship to yourself, to the world, to the ancestors, ownership becomes a really attractive thing in order to feel safe. in order to also feel connected and a sense of power against the threats of death and really isolation. And therefore, when you die, you want to pass on something as a legacy versus trusting that just you are becoming the land which you already were. And you become into the ancestral realms, and you become like kind of back into the collective belonging of the whole. So you can see how this kind of whittles itself down through history, gutting into the core of even how we control sexuality through these dynamics, all to compensate for this kind of initial core trauma of our species, which has been this loss of like the village unit.
Next slide.
Next slide.
So I want to speak then a little bit to, again, drawing upon Ray Eisler's work. So she categorizes domination culture and then partnership culture. And she uses the term Gailani to indicate that. Now, just to say a little bit about this, because this is now what we're going to be speaking to around, well, what's the mirror image of that, or the mirror opposite of a dominator culture relationship to these dynamics? And then what would a partnership culture dynamics be? And I just want to say that at the core, as I've come to understand, and we've maybe perhaps come to understand, at the core of partnership or domination is a different relationship to power. Because in a dominator culture, it's always the threat of force that eventually coerces another to do something, right? That's kind of at the core. And I mean, there's numerous examples throughout history and ongoingly where essentially if you don't get compliance as an oppressor or one applying power, wanting something from someone to do something, that the threat of force and violence is omnipresent. And so how free can you actually be, of course, in a dominator culture, if there's that threat of violence or being outcast and things like that? And so a partnership culture moves upon a very different matrix. And what we experience that heavily in a place like Tamera, as well as when I've interviewed guests, for example, from indigenous intact cultures, and they speak about how the dynamics move within their communities. It's very clear that it's a profound difference between this idea of power over versus power with. Power over versus power with, of course, is another way of saying it. So what does it mean to move with power with? That's the core of what we're wanting to bring forth, and then see how that can apply to all these different areas within relationship and society. Next slide. Or anything you want to say?
Let's keep it rolling.
Keep it rolling.
And so the question then, so reimagining village, what is village now in a modern setting? Because again, depending on what you have experience of or romanticized or tried and failed at, in quotations, you may have a different understanding of what we mean by village. But I think that we obviously need to be creative now in how we approach what village is, because I think it's also not a question to somehow flee the cities and, set up all these micro villages around the planet. I don't think the biosphere could sustain that, nor is it likely that that's going to happen on exodus en masse. But that we need to essentially recognize that to village as a verb, I think, is a more accurate understanding of what's being asked of us, as in it's an action rather than a place. It can be a place, certainly, but the ability to village, to move with a village understanding or village mindedness, a village consciousness, is what we're going to be speaking to here, as a way of essentially being an agent of this regenerative shift. Mm-hmm. Anything else, guys?
Yeah, to expand about that, on that, what we're really getting at is that when you are villaging, you are not facing life's troubles and triumphs alone. Entering out of the paradigm of separation and into a paradigm of mutual support and interdependence. And I think it's Stephen Jenkinson who speaks about this, and I'm sure many others, but there's actually, in the dominant culture, there's almost an aversion to being indebted to somebody, right? Which is interesting because we live, like our financial systems are based on a debt culture, like on a value of debt. And yet in the social fabric, there is perhaps a fear threshold that needs to be crossed to be truly indebted to somebody. And so to step out of a paradigm of transaction and into something that's much more relational, where you really start to imagine, how do we mutually support one another outside of a transactional capitalistic structure, but actually in a relationship model?
Yeah, which we're going to get into next, kind of the pathways towards this reimagining of village. But based on what Julia's saying, it really comes down to really sharing truth. And from that place, we actually come into a condition of, well, we actually need each other. And can we go towards the daring to share and then the possible fulfillment of our needs, of our lives through each other, versus into some like anonymous system that doesn't act, that only sees us as a consumer and doesn't offer much as far as belonging and connection.
Let's go to the next slide. Yeah.
Well, the one piece I want to say is just the drawing upon the collaboration I did with Charles Eisenstein, of course, who wrote Sacred Economics. In that, he speaks very clearly around, there's this, call it like veil of a sense that in the dominant culture, right, if you have enough wealth or enough financial wealth, you can essentially exist independent of relationship. So, and that's seen as a victory. Of course, you don't depend on anybody. And so that is a very kind of a hollow victory in some sense, because what it means is you are depending on people. It just means that you have to pay everyone to do those things for you, rather than move within a relational matrix, which requires a lot more in a different way, a different skill set, which again, unless you've grown up in that setting, is actually something that needs to be relearned. In many ways, unlearned the initial conditioning and then relearned how to move within a partnership context, which is what we're going to get into in a second.
Yeah, and this last thing, this is the thing I wanted to share, is that, you know, we, in some ways, I think we're trying to create here a more mature movement out of village being this carrot that is out there, another thing to go and seek and reach for. And it's actually more of a process of realizing and practicing how you are already in village with all of life right here, wherever you are living. There's a whole ecology you're already interacting with of humans and forces, spiritual and ecological. And can you just practice and participate with what is already right here, instead of exporting it as something else to go seek and attain and even kind of conquer? So we're trying to understand, how do we step out of these colonial mindsets, even as we approach village, not as a destination, but again, as a verb and a practice.
Next slide.
Next slide.
So I'll finish here with this one quote that I pulled from Subhanfu Samay in her book, The Spirit of Intimacy. And as we also, of course, are looking at relationships in this frame of our entire conversation beyond just us, here's an example of really testimony from a partnership culture that I would say, based on what we've been speaking to here. She says, "It is difficult for Indigenous people to conceive of life without a community, as it is for most Westerners to imagine life in a community. One of the principles of the Daguerre concept of a relationship is that it's not private. When we talk about our relationship in the village, the word our is not limited to two. And this is why we find it pretty hard to live in relationship in a modern culture that is lacking true community. In the absence of community, two people are forced to say this relationship is ours, when in fact, a community should be claiming ownership." So this will frame the next steps as we move to the next slide, yeah?
Yeah.
All right. Gosh, I feel like we could linger on that last slide for a while. There's so much to savor in that. We're going to start to talk about, now that we've really identified and established the waters that many of us are swimming in the dominant culture, how do we start to reimagine what partnership is? And the first thing I want to say before diving into the first bullet is that when we are talking about partnership, it is beyond romantic love. So there are many kinds of partnerships to be had. And we're going to later in this webinar get into a little practice exercise where you'll be able to explore what kind of partnerships and relationships that you have in your life. But to recognize that there is a very deep need for human beings to have many different kinds of relationships because of the multifaceted humans that we are. So, as an example, when we talk about partnerships in service, and this links back to the Saban Fusome quote that Ian just read, is that we are not as, let's say, if I'm in a partnership, a romantic partnership, and I am also connected to other people, that there is a third pole. There is often something that is a flowering of what brings two people together that I would say is almost like selfish to keep to oneself. Like, what if we start to think about to actually start to share the joys, the troubles, the triumphs, the creations of two people in a partnership, whether that partnership is creative, whether it's romantic, whether that partnership is oriented around raising children. How can the fruit of that create interdependent links? And to recognize when a partnership in its isolation and in its privacy starts to suck resource from community and from village, to recognize, and we'll get to that in the last bullet as well.
Yeah, and to really say that a function of partnerships, especially as it's spoken about in modern culture, is really around towards like providing a sense of attachment and secure attachment, which has become kind of the holy grail of the therapeutic world. But the thing is, the way that modern attachment theory, which I'm not going to go too deeply into what it is, and I think it's pretty much at this point in the like mainstream.
I can give a little definition.
Okay, give a little definition. Yeah.
Okay, I love this definition. It's secure attachment could be defined as I feel safe when we're together and easy when we're apart.
Right, and I think that in that kind of sense, as it's even defined there in the modern therapeutic lens, it's really positioned, I'd say, from actually a codependent framework where your secure attachment is still a function of two people. And I think that's, again, missing the wider perspective of the like village inheritance from where human beings came from, and that attachment was actually always a village function, and that primarily secure attachment is what you feel with the world, with creation, and you experience it in yourself and you experience it in relationships. But I think a thing we're trying to track here is that if we put all of our secure attachment kind of eggs in the basket of one person, we're actually missing out on the way that our whole relational web, all of the many peoples that we relate with in work, in friendship, in life, in love, those are all places to practice and experience attachment and to really try to strengthen those bonds of attachment. Again, reimagining attachment as something, a function of the relational web you are in. And this supports us coming out of a culture of codependency, which again, when people are deemed as codependent, it's often kind of thought of as like, well, that's your problem and you need to go fix it, versus like, well, maybe codependency, which is kind of the basis of when you're trying to control yourself or another person's behavior in order to keep the connection, or to keep the currency of belonging, that maybe the problem isn't in those two people, but it's that idea that that currency only exists in that very small circuit. That again, if we start to even see it as a function of the relational web that we are in, we can kind of naturally lift out of these codependent dynamics because we're re-embedding ourselves in a much larger system.
I want to also thread back to the partnership and service piece, in that this is something that is very strongly rooted in the teachings of Tamera. So if we look at dominant culture, which is very honeymoon based, right? Like the happily ever after endings that we see in films and the lustful expression of love. We have to understand that beyond that, there's actually a quick claiming of the word partnership, before, and because of the limited landscape of the kind of the single or the partnered, there's often like a whole spectrum of nuance that is missing, and that we could be served by coloring in all those nuances, because it takes time to recognize if a relationship is actually a partnership. And if we start to color in the nuanced spectrum, we can see, oh, this is really in a phase of lust. This is in a phase of exploration. This relationship is really meant to last for just this brief phase of this project and not beyond. If this is a sexual connection, but not meant to be a life partnership. And once we start to reframe that, we can also start to reimagine this concept of failure and endings, which often creates rupture and, again, isolation and separation. So it serves as a cycle, and there's so much more to color in within that.
Mm-hmm. And maybe just the last thing on, I think, what we're weaving towards is that, kind of as Sabanfu also said, partnership in all the different layers, like the partnership we have here as filmmakers is not really ours. We'd say it is collectively owned by all of you, in service to the whole, in service to whatever our aim is. And that, I think, a sign of a healthy partnership is is it contributing to the village? Is it contributing to the whole, or is it taking? And I think if you look in your life, I think we all know these couples as people that kind of just energetically suck because of the unhealth that they have for the variety of many reasons that happens. Or are they really contributing? Are they creating more relational bandwidth into the whole? And I think that's even a good metric by which to start to even gauge how healthy and regenerative our partnerships are in the world.
And of course, there's an ebb and flow, because there are times that we lean and we receive support from community. And then there's times when we are the pillars and we offer, whether we're single or partnered. And so I think it's really about this balance and not leaning too far into one side or the other. That creates, again, that paradigm of separation.
Do you want to go on to the next slide, Ian?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay, this is my section. Oh, relationships and community. How do we weave the web together? In some ways, this is the crux of what this webinar is about, because what we're talking about is how do we come out of separation and isolation and come back in together. And so what we have a number of definitions that we want to dive into with you all, and reframe and expand upon certain pillars that could hold us in the reimagining and the weaving, and the acknowledgement that we are deeply wired for connection. And so this, in a way, is in summary of some of what we've already talked about, that secure attachment, while we are wired for that, when we're born as babies, we need that with our primary caregivers. And yet we have the capacity as human beings to love more than one person, to love more than just our parents. I love the book Pleasure Activism from Adrienne Marie Brown. And she talks about that when we love, it doesn't happen in just a linear way where we love just our parents and then just our spouse, just our romantic partner, and just our children. Love and learning to love happens by practicing love. And so just like what we have unlearned, we have to endeavor to relearn together. And that can also, and I love that somebody in the chat wrote that you live in a village of your plants. There is so much to explore in the expression of our love with the landscape, with the ecosystems, with the relationship to the spirits that we have access to, as well as understanding the rigid forms that we've named at the beginning of this, and daring to think, how would I love somebody else's child? How could I expand my idea that a co-working relationship is maybe not fully devoid of eros? Maybe it is the intelligence of eros that brings us to the people and the places that we are meant to be. And so there is, as I'm looking at the graphic here, the background of our relationships and community, there is a certain flow and intelligence to what guides us in our lives. And that is an intelligence of eros, an intelligence of nature. And so I think that is the antidote to some of the rigid separatist structures that are the guiding forces of our dominant culture.
And I think just seeing that if love is not a scarce resource to be owned, and love is actually like a function of this wider ecology, I think the premise is, how do we tend that love in this whole ecology as a co-arising happening all the time? And we can't just section it off in any kind of way. We have to recognize how it is a flow, and that eros is also a flow moving through the ecosystem, and they need to be woven and tended together, or they're frankly not actually going to work, because the ecology will not be in communication and relationship with itself. I think you can go on to the next slide, where we're going to talk about, like, how do we actually do that? What does that actually mean to put our relationships into community and to tend community from that perspective of tending the relationships in them? So kind of the core concept that we're going to talk about is this one of embedment. And when we say embedment, what we mean is, like, how are we embedding? How are we nesting or creating a space of holding our relational worlds in the village? And just want to say, you probably know this in your personal life, but if you look at, like, what do you talk about when you hang out with groups of people that know each other, or you go to any village? It's like everyone is talking about each other's relational lives all the time. And actually, Tamera has a really funny story about how their global love school started, which is really kind of the container me and Ian and Julia went for as students when we were making our film, The Village of Lovers. Is that the founders of the global love school from Tamera were at these conferences. People are talking about climate change and this or that. But then when they got, like, you know, off camera or off like work, everybody would start wanting to talk about love and their relationships and the things that really matter. And that any village is full of what we might consider gossip, but it's actually understood as just being embedded, as being held in the village, and again, owned by the village. So this really begins with this core framing to step out of privacy. You know, most modern people, at least in the Western world, like, really think of your relational life and how your marriage is doing or your partnership. That is something private and not to be shared. And this is core idea that actually, that for it to have health, it needs to be embedded in and shared about, and also offered up as something that can create holding for others in the village. And this comes from really these core practices of truth and transparency, which is that, can we share, you know, with our friends, our networks here, honestly, transparently, what is going on in our relational life, our struggles, our triumphs. Maybe we're married and we're trying to have a kid, but it's hard, and we're having fertility issues. And, like, can we bring all of those transparently to the whole, and also recognize that sharing our struggles and our triumphs creates an opportunity for companionship, also for mutual support, for a deeper thread of belonging for others in our village, while at the same time actually allowing us to get the support of a wider circle. Because often the problems that we have can't be solved right here, because we're often going to be too locked into our pain bodies and into our own limited perspectives. But by daring to truthfully and transparently share it in that wider circle, the wider circle of our village, we're actually going to be able to receive the perspectives and insights that might allow us, like, a whole new path of possibility. And again, we do this in our culture mostly in therapy, but our therapists aren't really involved in our like relational worlds deeply. They're not really part of our village often. So what is it to actually, instead of just going to therapists, which are great, really creating a mutual support web where we begin to mutually support each other by embedding our lives together in that way.
You know, and I'm touched by this quote here from Natanya in the chat. I'm saying, I'm totally with all the theory of this, but it's frustrating how stratified relationships are in practice. People really have certain expectations that friendships are low priority in terms of time. Yeah, it's interesting when we decide to step out of hierarchies and private realms and decide to step into a circle. And so I want to expand on that idea of embedment. Sometimes it's a moment where, you know, we really need to call a circle because there's a charged topic, but there's also a cultural shift that we could start to think about. What does it mean to live as a circle? What does it mean that we start to think that my relationship with my primary romantic partner is poor if I am not rich in friendship and I am not investing in the other kinds of relationships with a mutual supportive flow of energy, care? How do we create communities of care? If we're single, if we're partnered, if we're with multiple partners, how do we create and live in a way where we stop going from hierarchies to a flow? It's a real question, and I think it's a paradigm shift. Something we'll explore later in a practice section.
Ian, do you want to riff more on the next two parts of calling a circle and social technologies?
Yeah, well, what I'm called to say is, now, when we say social technology, we're not saying Facebook and Instagram. And I also think when we say stepping out of privacy, for a lot of people, that's often a go-to right now, where they kind of perform transparency or truth on social media, for example. And in some spaces that's like, oh wow, look at you being so transparent, you know. But oftentimes that's such a big vessel in order to share these things that it often becomes a kind of unconscious narcissism, right? To be seen as transparent and truthful, but the retention space isn't there. It's just a wide, big net to, you know, get more likes, for example. And these are compensatory valuations, you know, to get more likes or more followers. That in not touching the deeper need. And so when there's this question like, how do we, you know, have the time to deeply step into these realms? I mean, if we relinquish how much effort is being put into all of these pseudo ways of not actually getting those needs met, likely it would free up a lot of time to actually craft something that's a lot more modest and intimate with folks that are can be embedded in a more deep way. This is something that Stephen Jenkinson also said, which is when we don't have 20 trusted people that we can really connect deeply with, then we feel like we need 20,000, right? So again, it's that sense of we overcompensate based on the pseudo needs being met that the overculture offers to us, but it never really touches that deep place of belonging, feeling seen, and being of consequence to each other. And so social technologies, as we're naming or calling a circle, this is a way of gathering folks together to create a proper retention space to gain perspective, to gain insight. And it also requires from the people showing up that they actually also step out of what's often, particularly in conflict, right? There's this a kind of rush to polarize into, you know, for or against, like kind of create sides often. And of course that doesn't help because it's not on the side of the relationship. It's on the side of like one or the other. We kind of have these binaries that we're programmed into. That it requires something else to hold a wider frame of the organism and the ecosystem as a whole. Now, Tamera as well has something called Forum, which is another social technology, of which if you saw our film, you saw it in action. But it's a way of gathering together, again, in a wider circle with community and facilitation to really move big energy, to bring insight and awareness to your own process around a variety of things in community. And the result often is actually deeper trust regenerated amongst participants rather than one might expect as a kind of ostracization or othering based on you're really sharing what's going on. When you really share within the right context, it often deepens folks and trust is built and a deeper sense of solidarity, which I think we'll get to in a moment.
And just want to say that really what's coming to me, I think most of us here, we've all sat in circle in a workshop, in a retreat,
don't know that.
maybe in a festival. But I think that's largely how we experience it in the Western world, is that new culture or regenerative culture is practiced often in these siloed spaces that are like workshops. And I think what we're talking about here is how do we integrate that workshop culture, like the weekend warrior workshop culture, into our actual lives by actually calling circles, not just as a practice, but like when things are actually going on. That, and often we do this as like small examples of easy, low-hanging fruit ways to do this, you know, as part of like tending different rites of passage for relationships or individuals, whether it be somebody's birthday or somebody is changing careers or somebody went on, say, a big trip or perhaps the ancestral pilgrimage, that they call a circle maybe before or when they're back to really share the like story. Or we could even call a circle to share the story of our partnership as filmmakers and embed that in the whole, especially in times of transition or times of like struggle, to receive support and also celebrate. And then as we get into in our community here in California, and also the community I've been a part of with Ian up in Canada, you know, we start to use some of these social technologies on a more regular basis to actually form these kind of pulses of coming back into shared spaces of transparency and a support. And it doesn't even fully matter what the social technologies are. I think it just, after a time, it becomes a facet of culture building to start to create like ritualistic ways of coming together and like share. And you can just try that out. You can try out just having a new moon or full moon sharing circle. We're going to talk a little bit later about affinity spaces, but like, how do we actually start weaving these as cultural practices into our actual daily lives versus just far off things that we pay a bunch of money and go to and then come back from, but they don't really integrate.
Excited?
So let's move on to solidarity, because it weaves well into what we've built up so far. All right, solidarity, tending the ecosystem of love, collaboration versus competition, piecework is here and now. Okay, let's unpack that. So the basic definition of solidarity is, at the basis, a mutual support. It's, I stand next to John and I endeavor to find out what are his hopes and dreams, and I become his teammate for making those happen. I keep those in my heart and in my mind, knowing that my friend John has this vision and this longing and this struggle. And how do I become a friend and ally and partner to him in those things? Sometimes it's as simple as having it in mind and represencing it for others who we're woven with so that we can have John in mind. Sometimes it's like conspiring for him to get more of what he wants. And so in Tamera, which is a free love community, and their expanded definition of free love is love free of fear, violence, and lies. But to say, when in that ecosystem of people who may be sharing sexual and romantic partners, there is this is one of their pillars and core ethics, is that solidarity is a pathway to peace and a pathway out of competition. So when we start to think about being in solidarity, if I start to think about being in solidarity with my husband, I think, wow, sometimes I think I know who he's attracted to, and we're also in a partner dance community. I can know him. I dare to want to know the truth of who he is and want to allow that he gets to have the kind of fulfillment of dancing with the kind of people that he's attracted to, that light him up and bring him joy. And the same for him with me. As a bisexual person, I enjoy also relationships with women. He stands in solidarity with me despite our committed marriage, that I get to experience that part of myself in my relational life. So that's just one example.
Right. And I'd say it's not in spite of your committed marriage. That's like a foundation of your committed marriage. And that's really, I think, a foundation of, I think we're trying to say is that solidarity is a foundation of practicing village, of restitching community and relationships together, which at a core level is getting out of me and mine and that ownership and how can I get the most in this situation, to actually just seeing that my life and my relationships are a function of the ecosystem I am in. And to really be in solidarity can be as simple as you start to tend the ecosystem of love. The same way that if you're tending a land or tending a garden, you need to be tending the whole ecology. You need to be tending the soil. You can't just you could, but we've seen that it doesn't really work long-term to throw a bunch of this chemicals, deplete the soil and try to grow that massive tomato. It's like a whole ecosystem that needs to be tended. And that is being in solidarity with all the facets of that ecosystem, because you start to see that you and your relationships are essentially a extension of or a function of that ecosystem, which fundamentally shifts that framework of relational competition. And the core, we've trained to believe the survival of the fittest is at the core of evolutionary drives, which I think that theory from Darwin is being poked a lot of holes into currently, because actually I'd say that ecosystems are constantly collaborating, and that love and sexuality and relationships, we need to learn to see how can these collaborate. How can my partnership with Julia be in solidarity with her marriage and collaborate with her marriage? And how can we be in solidarity with Ian and his partnership and his marriage? And this doesn't always also look like, it can look like whatever is true, which also can be, I am in solidarity by being honest with you, by being like, hey, I'm seeing that thing that feels unhealthy, right? That's part of stepping out of the privacy into solidarity. Is I care about you enough to be like, whoa, what's going on here? I want to get curious. I want to lean in because I'm feeling something that feels a little wobbly.
Yeah.
And I actually care enough to that's mine too.
And perhaps the most difficult aspect of solidarity is when we feel like maybe John and I want the same thing, and it could be that we compete for it. Or maybe we're attracted to the same person and we could possibly compete for that person's affection. However, actually knowing and making it transparent that we may want the same thing provides the opportunity to tend to the solutions and the sharing and the consideration of the impact if one of us were to make a big footprint somewhere.
Yeah.
And I think we should segue into conflict. I'm maybe sure Ian has more to add to this, but Ian, I think you're also going to lead conflict. Do you want to segue from this into that?
Yeah, thanks for this. So as we shift now, so what is conflict within a communal context, conflict within partnership? Now, I think a challenge that many face now, as we seem to be moving into a kind of conscious, progressive framework around relationship, again, depending on what circles you move in, but there seems to be now different implicit expectations on partnership. And I'm talking now about from an individualistic paradigm, which is that you yourself have to be aware enough of your own triggers. You have to, heal your own attachment system, and all have to do that, as again, a kind of heroic individual on this path. And part of that with conflict is a big deal, obviously, because stepping into any kind of intimate relationship often brings up, as we've said, all of the stuff, all of the childhood wounding, all of the unconscious patterning, things like that. So often you get into conflict. And now conflict within a partnership can often be too hot, right? It can bring up too much. It can just be quite destructive. Or it's not there at all. Maybe a couple is conflict avoidant, and so that creates a different kind of rift within a relationship. But moving into conflict from a conscious place is that, yes, it can be an invitation into deeper intimacy when one is able to, Tamera also has a term, I think, to disidentify, in a sense, right? That you can be aware of what's triggering to you or wanting to step into conflict, as well as the part of you that also wants to find a healing path and sort of be in solidarity with another. And so how that looks in intimate relationship, of course, is this cycle of rupture and repair, or harmony, rupture, and repair, as it's often situated. And that a couple, of course, that can only be in the harmony, and then a rupture happens and they don't know how to repair, ends up drifting further and further apart until oftentimes the relationship ends. But a community as well goes through the same things. I know a lot of communities I've spoken to, and they speak to that. They say, we went through this rupture and it never really got repaired well. And now there's this kind of distance between people. They don't want to talk about certain things. There's a fear of even stepping into a kind of a council space, or like these processes that we've named, because they fear the inability to actually navigate these challenges. And so, yes, it takes a certain skill set, but also a certain courageousness in order to take a partnership or take a relationship and embed that within a trust field, within community, and trust that you'll be held and mirrored, and in a way diffuse the intensity that often comes from, like we said, the big forces that show up in intimate partnership. And so in that sense, yes, it's a collective effort, a collective responsibility to navigate this territory together. Anything you guys want to add to that?
Yeah, and I think this is like, I'd say that in some ways this gets to the core of it, right? Because, maybe your partnership in isolation can be fine until there's conflict. I think the first thing on that is, one, as Ian's saying, that secure attachment or deeper intimacy comes from conflict. The rupture and repair cycles, what actually builds safety, not everything going well. And that the core difference is, and this last bullet point here, is that when there's conflict, it's not your issue or my issue. It's not even just our issue. It's our issue. It's that we are experiencing collective patterns. It's not a personal failing that then we should hide because we feel ashamed that we're as a couple in conflict. And if we're in conflict, it's affecting our film team, it's affecting our marriage, it's affecting our community. And it's actually an opportunity to be woven deeper into the community. And when Ian was talking about, there's a rupture and maybe it didn't fully repair, often I'd say in partnerships or relationships of all kind, it's because it didn't have enough support from the community. And then often it takes that deeper, maybe the conflict from a more soul level happened to weave you deeper into a system of support. But we have to be willing to see it as like, not, oh, fuck, a conflict, but like, yes, another opportunity to go deeper with those people, another opportunity to go deeper in our community. It's actually from the kind of avoidance and exporting of conflict that we aren't living in deeper, intimate communities right now. And if we started tending the many conflicts of our relational lives together as community, that would be a huge leap into weaving this all together. And actually, it's so much just easier. Even having a third person present when two people are in conflict already changes the dynamic so much. And that Tamera, again, the subject of our film, people never process one-on-one because they know it's too much for two pain bodies, essentially in conflict, to be able to hold. And they need the bigger emotional and consciousness surface area of a larger group to be able to integrate that trauma that is coming up and wanting to be healed, which again is like conflict is like the things coming to the surface to be healed. It's not like a bad thing. So it's really adopting this orientation of being bump friendly, being conflict friendly.
In the most recent land-based community that I was in here, that's actually in our town, just 5 minutes on the road from where I live now, is 18 adults and 7-8 kids living on 22 acres. And one of the core ethics that we adopted in our conflict resolution was this quote, that conflict is an invitation for a relationship to deepen. So again, I feel like throughout this webinar, what we're trying to do is reframe from the places where we sever connection, where we go isolate, where we separate into our dominant cultural structures, and actually understand the bump friendliness is an invitation for deepening intimacy.
Yeah, and
there's a possibility that we can really start to understand what is it that is the deeper material of the other person? How are they hooking us? And we start to then see that we maybe are creating attachment with other people besides romantic partners. We actually are bringing up our material, as Ian was saying. And so how do we start to recognize that that is community in the making when conflict arises? And to tend that well is to take a stance for peace cultures, to say, we don't agree. We're not going to go to war. We're going to look at ourselves, unlink our codependencies, and put our best foot forward toward repair to return to love.
Right. And I'll say one more thing, and then I think we should keep going as we're getting closer to our time. And we're going to go about 10 minutes over, as we started 10 minutes late, just so you all know. Just that as a single person currently not in a partnership, like a life romantic partnership, instead of sitting here being like, oh, only when I get a partner with all these things, I've been practicing attachment and intimacy and healing with a plethora of my friends. And that's taught me so much about how I might actually have a thriving partnership in the future. Because I'm like, oh, I don't got to do all the darn work with my one partner. And that's actually what made it not work last time. It's like, can I spread this out and recognize my patterns, our collective patterns, are coming up all the time in every relationship if I'm willing to lean in. And as I think, Natanya was sharing, like actually making my other relationships as important of learning and healing opportunities as a core partnership could be. And maybe Ian, we go to the next slide. So the pleasure activism of our times. So this is all coming. I want to say this has been a short, succinct overview of things that we've built a whole body of work around. But that, again, the reason we're doing this is because we're coming from an activist lens. And that, Adrienne Marie Brown, which is one of our, I'd say, teachers and influencers, who's written the book, Emergent Strategy and Pleasure Activism, has kind of laid out this idea that the true activism that's going to work isn't going to be only pushing against systems of power. It isn't only going to be going on the front lines and like fighting, which is great. But we have to actually weave activism into the pleasure principle, into the way life in my body, in our bodies, in my heart is naturally pulling me towards things. And that we are being naturally pulled towards, connection, community, love, be in some ways one of the deepest forms of activism, because if we actually get fulfilled in these core basic need ways, we can completely restructure the consumer, like capitalist basis of our society and form a much more simple and just society where needs are actually getting met. And this is really where the inner system change of this shift from competition and separation relationally kind of morphs into the outer system change. And Bryony asked a question in the chat around, what about like capitalist housing markets as being a block to village? And that's totally true. Like, we don't live in a structural world currently in the West set up for village with like all of the like neighborhood, nuclear family, single homes. And yet I found that the more that people that we know and we've bounded together with people and practice village, that opportunities kind of emerge in life where properties come up that have like old churches or other things come up that arise that then become a container for what is forming between the people. And I'd say in that sense, like structure in a way, I think follows the way that we start to weave ourselves. And we allow this intelligence of Eros, we actually see fundamentally, this is a whole deep point we could give 5 webinars on, but the like re-stitching Eros as not some like unruly, even demonic force, which is really the like Judeo-Christian lens often that it's coming from in the culture we were like bred in, as actually a intelligence, as the intelligence of Gaia, of the earth. And can we see that actually trusting that Eros as the deepest seat of our intuition is enough, that will lead us to deeper pathways of liberation and really into restitching a relational, animate peace culture that begins here in the way I relate with and stand in solidarity and love in my life right here, right now. And that ripples out into the world.
You know, there's a book called Finite and Infinite Games. Has anybody read that? Maybe give a holler if you've read it or heard of it.
Yep.
And it's a book I read more than 10 years ago, but I often go back to it, and it's one of those I can kind of open to any page and really meditate on a single passage. And one of those passages suggests that sexuality, the force of sexuality, it's not that society is creating the separatist structures, like, for example, the architectural limitations that have been mentioned in the chat that keep us separate, or the structures of monogamy that keep it relegated. But that it's the reverse. It's the structure of those is actually a response to the big energies of sexuality. And so they create containment. And so I like to geek out on cultural architecture and social architecture to think, what does it take if we want to, we can't all necessarily go and move on land. That's not the solution that we're suggesting here, but to start to reinvent what can happen when within a group of people, you start to redefine what are the, quote, appropriate containment structures for Eros and sexuality to flow based on common agreement, based on consent. So actually rewriting agreements within a group of people that transcend those dominant cultural impositions that keep many of us from having the fulfilling lives and connections that we want. So I like to think about, the power that we can have as collectives to come together and create new agreements for structures that do elicit more pleasure and connection.
And where we get more relational surface area, we get more in the practice of village. We also don't need to set containers that are like our hills to die on, that I am this way, I am monogamous, I am with this one person. We can actually be more fluid to the flow of love and eros and just joy in life, and have more of a rapid attunement in our relational lives, in the social ecology, to what is actually flowing, that can, I think, just actually be more supportive by that agility, because again, we have more support to actually be true with ourselves and each other. And I know that we're getting close, so maybe Ian, it's good to flow to the last slide, and then we can leave a little bit of time for questions. Do you want to say
right. Yeah,
we'll do this in like a minute, and then we got it, of course, in the last part. So
all right, my friends, so I want to engage you. We're going to take a couple minutes for this. So
I would just say, Julie, just lay out the practice, but then they can do that on their own time after the webinar. Yeah.
So relational mapping is a tool that I learned from one of my friends and teachers, Zahava Z. Griss. And Z, along with Jessica Fern, who's an author of the book Polysecure, together they created a map exercise. And so I want to invite you all, if you have something to write with, you can write this down and do it on your own time. And also after this, we're going to be sending you a link, because this actual exercise takes about 2 hours to really go through. And we have a link to Z's evergreen exercise that you can definitely dive into as a resource. But just to start, imagine yourself in a bubble. You can write it on a page. And then around you, imagine the closest 5 to 8 connections that you have in your life. This could be your child, it could be a partner, it could be a close friend, a creative collaborator, a coworker. Who are the 5 to 8 closest people to you? And beyond that, if you imagine the kinds of intimacy available between human beings, there are multitudes. And so you can start to imagine that there are, we're not just talking about romantic or sexual or not. Start to imagine and write down, feel into what actually exists between you and each person. So you might have with one person a sexual, co-parenting, financial, domestic, the list goes on. With another person, it might be creative, artistic, financial, social. There are many. And so you start to list those under each person. And then the beauty of this mapping exercise is we actually start to identify the secure attachments that we have in our web. So you take a number from 1 to 5, 5 being extremely secure, 1 being insecure, and you put a number to each relationship. And again, the definition of secure attachment being, I feel safe when we're together and easy when we're apart. And you put a number to each relationship. It's a place to start to acknowledge the community and the connections that you already do have. And if you go deeper into the work with Z in a recording, you'll start to be invited into prompts and exercises to imagine what more you may seek and start to reclaim the power to create the communities that you wish to have.
And I think that it's a benefit of just even mapping right now, like how is the relational health of your like ecosystem? How much intimacy do you have? And where can you identify possible gaps? Like, wow, I only have even 3 people I can like write down that are in my like intimate web. And I'm only getting these few needs met of the possible needs. And even just getting that data for yourself can start to help you like, wow, how do I want to consciously start weaving my relational ecology around myself? And if you can shift to the next slide, the beautiful thing is, and thank you everybody for bearing with us as we're navigating tech and also how we're really trying to present an arc of a huge amount of content here in 90 minutes, really in service to us weaving and kind of spirit weaving us together over these many years, so that beyond the film, we want to create containers of co-learning and practice. And one such container that Spirit has told us to create for this summer is what we're calling Summer of Love. This Forbidden Fruit live cohort, which is an existing course that we have that we're going to be running a 10-week live cohort for this summer, starting in late June. And that's going to be an amazing container where us, along with other guest teachers, we're going to meet bi-weekly, going through certain aspects of this course, really narrowing in on like this practice and other practices and frameworks, and also bringing forth from each of you or each of the people in the course, what is actually going on in your life right now? What are actually your like struggles? How do we share them, and how can we co-learn and have a container of support and learning and research together so that we can actually take more significant steps to building a healthy relational village ecology around us? And so you can find more info on our website, and we're going to send you the link. Maybe Ian, you can even pop the link in the chat. But that's going to be starting June 26th. And we'd love to see many of you there for opportunity to learn and go deeper. Also, I want to say that next week at this exact same time, we're doing another webinar. We didn't get into it much today as we're doing it next time, but we're here to really support the idea of a third pathway beyond this like tense binary of monogamy and polyamory, which gets so divisive. And so people get so identified with that. And we are going to give a whole other webinar sharing about, well, is there perhaps a deeper evolutionary pathway to how we can think about the way we are in like love that actually is a like extension of this more village ecology approach to creating a more beautiful world? Is there anything on either of those, Ian or Julia, you want to add?
Go ahead, Juliet. Well, we have one more slide, right, to complete this talk. And should I move to that now?
Sure.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Ta-da. Yeah, go ahead, John or Juliet.
I mean, I can just say that other ways to stay connected right now, we have a school that's actually spelled that way, which is like an online platform, which you can join, I think for like $7 a month, which is just pretty much the cost for us to like run it, where we have a bunch of other like content and courses. And we have a community currently of 700 people growing really each like week in dialogue and really sharing in this practice and like research. And actually our course this summer is going to be held within that school framework, which also gets you access to this global community forever. And we also have a Facebook group of a few thousand people where we're often posting and sharing. And just for us, trying to create containers for all of us to step into to really continue to research. You know, Tamera is 45 years of a research experiment. We're here sharing our own research and continuing on in this research frame. And we actually need you all to be co-researching with us. So we want to invite you into these containers so we can stay connected and be in that research and be in that learning together. Anything else, Ian and Julie, you want to add about that before we sign off here?
I would add that the course is a way to be in dialogue, whereas this was more of a presentation format. And there is, we've also been deep students of emergence. And I trust that as we dive into the cohort together live this summer, we will be learning from you, you will be learning from us, we will be feedbacking each other and adapting our lesson plans to what is really co-arising in our collective field. And that's one of the things we love so much about this cultural repair work, really, is to be listening for the resonance, for where we can, illuminate the places that would bring us to more regenerative cultural practices.
I want to say one final thing, Ian, is that, you know, the same way we're talking about embedding ourselves in a relational ecology to support our relational lives, doing this course is us more globally stepping into a wider ecology so each of us can really step into village in the way that we've been talking about on a more local level. And the course is like really the culmination of our decade-long research, and that I feel confident that going from the start to the end of the course, all of us there are going to be transformed and really empowered around creating the relational ecologies that can sustain and really thrive our like lives. And we're going to be doing that together, and it's going even deeper beyond the end of the course. So we look forward to welcoming you, many of you like there. Thank you for this time now. We'd always love to hear your feedback and your like questions. You can connect us through our website or through Facebook or on our school. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Appreciate your time. And for those of you that'll listen later on the recording, yeah, thank you for tuning in. Yeah.
And we will be emailing this, right, as a follow-up to everybody.
Yeah, all the links will be followed up